Well, we left off part one with my sweater and I asking you, so how ancient is this Christian belief in December 25th as being the birth date of Christ? Is there any way that we can kind of get to the bottom of that?
Yeah, like I said before, there is a lot of evidence actually. So in the very same codex, the chronograph of 354, where it lists the birthday of the unconquered, it also lists the birthday of Jesus on December 25th. The importance of that is that this is a Christian document.
Yeah, I was going to say, because it's like it's a pagan feast and a Christian feast listed.
So if the narrative is that Christians are taking over this pagan holiday and trying to suppress the pagan one, well, why would they include it in the same codex that they themselves put together?
Right.
Okay. The second piece that's interesting about this codex is that Jesus is, the part where it names Jesus as his birthday on December 25th, that part of the codex is actually dated earlier than the chronograph of 354. It's dated to the year 336.
Oh, wow.
Which means that technically speaking, in the written record that has come down to us from the ancient world, whenever December 25th is associated with anybody, it's first associated with the person of Jesus of Nazareth.
Wow. So the documentary evidence shows us that the first reference to anybody being born on December 25th is actually Christ.
And the first time you have any reference to any pagan religious festival being held on December 25th is the chronograph, which is 354. That's the earliest. So those are the first two major pieces of evidence from just that document, from that codex. Then there is all the evidence of the calculation theories that are out there and the chronological theories that are out there. And you can go look them up. The work of Thomas Telly is very influential. In the 1990s, wrote a book on the origins of the liturgical year. But all these ways that the early church fathers chronologically arrived at December 25th. For our purposes, we'll hit on one that I really like, and that is it has to do with the Proto-Evangelium of James. Now, the Proto-Evangelium. It's an early infancy narrative of Jesus. It's actually the gospel outside of the New Testament, where we derive a lot of our traditions about Mary, about Mary's parents, who they were, Joachim and Anna.
Tons of Eastern Orthodox traditions about Saint Elizabeth, John's mother, and even the prehistory of John the Baptist and going out into the desert with his mother and things. There's a lot of that kind of stuff.
So in other words, the reason we bring that up is because it's a very influential early document of the church. And it's in the Proto-Evangelium of James where Zechariah, so John the Baptist's father, is seen to be serving in the temple on the Day of Atonement. Now you kind of see where I'm going with this.
Because now you can pinpoint some dates.
Exactly. So if we know when Zechariah was serving in the temple, and if it's the Day of Atonement, that means he was serving in the temple in the autumn, because that's when the Day of Atonement is in the Jewish calendar, sometime between September and October. Now, if you take that Proto-Evangelium and you compare it with the Gospel of Luke, right? The Gospel of Luke tells us that John the Baptist was how many months older than Jesus?
6 months.
6 months older. So if Zechariah is serving in the temple, and very shortly after that, he and his wife Elizabeth conceived John the Baptist, that means John the Baptist is born on or around the summer solstice in June. And in fact, we celebrate the feast of John the Baptist in June 24th, right? So if John is born in June, 6 months from there is late December, right? The winter solstice, December 25th.
Okay, so that's modern scholars, for the most part, talking about, linking up the Proto-Evangelion of James and Luke's Gospel to sort of arrive at some of these calculations. Just knowing the early church fathers, these guys were very meticulous about dates, calculations, years, seasons. It would seem very bizarre to me if maybe they didn't do that kind of stuff. So, is there any evidence of church fathers arriving at these same conclusions, looking at these same documents?
And in fact there is. So really three church fathers. So Evodius is the first, and Evodius, we only have one fragment from him that's preserved in a later writing, but Evodius just comes out and says, December 25th was the date.
And what year is Evodius?
So Evodius by tradition is a hero of the apostles. He's late 1st century, early 2nd century. And one of his writings is preserved in a later writing. And he comes out and says it. And he's linking in the same excerpt December 25th and the high priesthood of Zechariah. So we can see that he's doing the same kind of calculation using the Proto-Evangelium or the tradition that preexists the Proto-Evangelium of James. You also have Julius Africanus doing the same exact chronology work. Now, both these fathers predate Emperor Aurelian in 274.
Okay.
So this is at least early 3rd century. The Proto-Evangelium itself is late 2nd century.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there's Hippolytus. Hippolytus did a lot of chronology work.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of places in his writings where you can tell he's implying that December 25th.
He's assuming that day.
Is yes, exactly. He's assuming that the day is December 25th.
Okay.
There is a piece of writing from Hippolytus where he comes out and says December 25th is the birthday of Christ. You do get scholars who say, well, that's a later interpolation.
Okay.
Now, that hasn't been proven. That's just a theory, right? They're just probably saying that just so they can fit their thesis, history of religion's thesis. So you basically have 3 really early church fathers who were most likely reading the Proto-Evangelium James, comparing it with the Gospel of Luke, and putting the pieces together, coming and arriving at December 25th. Okay. However, you do have St. John Chrysostom doing that very thing.
Okay.
So in the year 386, he writes a homily, and in that homily, he's talking about the high priesthood of Zechariah, and he dates the birthday of Christ on December 25th because of that chronology.
Okay, so then there is some evidence then of the fathers connecting the Proto-Evangelium James and the Gospel of Luke and sort of coming to the same conclusion that some of these modern scholars are also doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then what about some other things? I would assume there's other calculations or something with that.
Yeah, so there's also the astrological theory. Okay, so this is, early Christians are already geared toward looking to the stars for signs.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, the Gospels, I mean, you look at the Gospel of Matthew, Luke, obviously the coming of the Magi is a big one. You see the Magi are looking at what's going on in the star, and it's not like the Gospel writer is like discrediting that. He's actually lending credence to it. Like, that was in the sky.
Well, it's because it's because from the beginning in the book of Genesis, God said, why did He create the lights?
Exactly. Yeah.
To be for signs,
for times, seasons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they're kind of geared to that, and the astrological theory that early Christians were doing was looking at the symbology of the sun. Because if you're looking at the winter solstice as kind of the birthday of Christ, December 25th was the winter solstice before the 4th century in Rome. If you're looking at it, you're saying, well, that's the time when the sun is the lowest in the sky. It's the time when it's the dimmest, right? But it's also the time when it starts to augment, when light starts to grow.
Yeah.
And so that has clear theological implications for the birth of the Messiah.
Yeah, see, I love that. It's such a rich way of looking at, I guess, calculating this, right? Yeah. Because the fathers are not just going to, like, in this boring way, like, look at texts. They're also going to say, well, okay, the texts are leading us here, the tradition is leading us here, but what about what God thinks? Like, did God leave us any signs?
Did He? Yeah.
It's like, so they're like looking into nature too. It's like, well, He would have done something too in the signs.
That's
of
a
the
great
sky,
point. Yeah. And so the point there is that this kind of buttresses.
Yeah. It's not that it's the whole argument, but they're like, wow, doesn't it make even more sense now?
Well, not only that Christians are geared to look for signs in nature, in creation, but they're specifically geared to look for solar signs for the Messiah, right?
Right.
Because you have the prophet Malachi prophesies of the Messiah, and he refers to the Messiah with a very interesting title. He calls the Messiah the Son of Righteousness, S-U-N, the Son of Righteousness, right? Or in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, right, Jesus is called the bright morning star, the day spring from on high.
Yep.
So all these kind of stellar and solar images and titles have already been given to the Messiah and given to Jesus in particular.
Yeah.
And so it's very natural for the church fathers to look at, well, if the chronologies are leading us to December 25th, then yes, let's look at nature and, it is leading us to think theologically about that same time period.
So then that's some early evidence that Christians are not primarily looking to like go into competition with pagans and replace a pagan holiday, but they're actually like consulting not only the texts of the Proto-Evangelium of James and Luke, but they're also looking at the signs. They're looking at the winter solstice and these kinds of things to sort of come to these conclusions.
Right.
So, but now you mentioned some Western fathers there. You mentioned St. John Chrysostom, an Eastern father. So it seems like we're sort of tracking East and West, sort of coming to the same conclusion. But was there ever any time of disconnect, or where they weren't sure in the East, but they were in the West, or vice versa, or how does that work?
Yeah, it seems like I guess we could say the first date that was celebrated for the birthday of Jesus was January 6th. Throughout most of the rest of the church, through the Eastern Empire, in Egypt, in the East, Asia Minor. But you start to see in the 4th century, Eastern fathers begin to adopt the Western date. And so, St. Augustine is saying, that December 25th in Rome has been the long-standing tradition. St. Jerome saying that. In the East, Gregory of Nazianzus is saying that. St. John Chrysostom is saying it in his famous sermon on the Christmas date in 386. He says that Rome has held this, quote unquote, from the beginning.
Wow.
So that's 386. Now, even if you allow for some hyperbole there, right, some overemphasis or whatever, that's still 386.
Yeah.
And you'd have to assume, well, it has to be at least since the 3rd century, maybe the 2nd century, that he's speaking to.
Yeah.
And none of the church fathers, East or West, ever say that they're taking over a pagan holiday.
Right.
That never comes up. They don't give that as a reason. And they have no reason not to say that, because it happens in other instances, right? I mean, even when you were looking at church buildings.
Yes, exactly. So even when when I was doing the history of evangelism in England, you would see that when they would name a church in England, they would name it after something in Rome, and so they would be like, oh, so Saint Mary and all the martyrs in England, right? But really they were naming it after a church that was taken, or a temple that was taken over in Rome, the Pantheon, right?
Of all the,
and so it's to all the gods. Well, the Christians would take it over and baptize it and be like Mary and all the martyrs, So it's Christians weren't ashamed or embarrassed about baptizing something and bringing it into Christian meaning. So there's no reason why I wouldn't see Christians looking at it and saying, "Oh yeah, the birth of the unconquered Son. That Son is Jesus." You know what I mean? They would love. They would love.
And that's part of the astrological part of it. You do see church fathers all over the place making that connection between the winter solstice and Jesus' birthday.
Now, what I find incredibly interesting about what you just said, with St. John Chrysostom adopting the date because of what Rome was
he says we adopted about 10 years ago. He gives you the date. So now we're pushing it to 376.
That's huge. That's huge because the East has always been dogged about tradition. I mean, that is what they're all about. In the West, we've been a little bit more willing to bend and move things around. The East is, in fact, even to this day in the East, you have a schism between the old calendarists and the new calendarists. You know what I mean? They don't mess with that calendar and they don't mess with their feast days. So the fact that they would be willing to say, oh, then they have it right. We need to fix it in a way in their tradition.
Yeah, you're right. That in itself is great evidence for December 25th being the long-standing tradition. And St. John Chrysostom in that homily, he says that one of the reasons he gives for taking on the date and acknowledging the date, he says, the census that Augustus put out that appears in the Gospel of Luke, well, that happened from Rome, and Rome has the records.
Oh, that's a great point.
The dating records of the birth of Jesus, and so he's much more willing to accept it then, because he says they've been practicing from the beginning. The chronology works out, and guess what? They have the archives.
Yeah, and the astrology. All of it to get taken together.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes for one case. Yeah. In the light then of just what has been presented here, and this is by no means exhaustive.
Yeah,
I mean, this is
streamlined.
Just a quick snippet of the evidence and the debates that have been had. I'm sure every person who's interested in this turns on the History Channel each year and still hears the Sol Invictus stuff, and so they're wondering why are there still scholars doing this? So I mean, it just seems like it would be out of convenience on the one hand, because it's just historiographical tradition at this point to keep regurgitating it, and there's also obviously a little bit of snarkiness in academia and anti-Christianity.
Yeah, we definitely encountered that.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why I would keep going forward. But what would be kind of our sort of grand conclusion then? What can we sort of end with then?
At the most, what we can say is, at the most, if Sol Invictus and Jesus' birthday land on the same day and they're celebrating on the same day, it's maybe out of coincidence.
Right. Yeah.
But the evidence shows more so that this was a date that Christians adopted first, and a better argument can be made that pagans were trying to compete with the Christians.
Right.
And I think this better explains actually the evidence in Emperor Julian trying to legitimize what he's practicing in 362.
Yeah.
I think this better explains.
Yeah. It sort of it more satisfies Occam's razor. It's it's the most likely explanation.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise you're trying to do some mental gymnastics, or you're doing some gymnastics with the primary sources in order to get yourself there.
Yeah. And the second thing I would say, the second conclusion, is that Christians arrived at this date, whether it was through chronology or astrology, biblical evidence, or was passed on from before, or it was a pre-existing tradition that they then tried to explain using chronology, astrology, and biblical stories.
Yeah, and just, I mean, my personal takeaway from it would be just to say that, you know, what we're not saying, right? We're not saying that, yes, because of all this, therefore December 25th is the birthday of Christ. Like, what we're more really saying is that Christians believed it to be.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like Christians
and believed it to be before pagans ever considered the winter solstice as a religious holiday.
Exactly. Yeah.